Thank you so much. Good evening. Patrick, man, that's, it's tough to speak after an introduction like that, man. I really appreciate that. Seriously, that's a great job. I feel like just actually giving the stage back up to you if you want to actually give my remarks. But sincerely, I really appreciate it. I appreciate all the hard work that you're doing as well. And, and also just, Dean Rutherford, you are not, the fact that the job that you've done has not only been extraordinary in terms of the leadership of the school, but the fact that you are training this country's next generation of leaders. You, your staff, and your faculty understand something that I and many other people know that is true, is that public service doesn't necessarily have to be an occupation, but it must be a way of life. It must be something that all of us do and an obligation that all of us have. And so just thank you for your leadership and for everything you've done to bring me here, for Nikolai for all the support and for taking care of me since I've been over here, and Bob, I'm not sure where Bob is. I got a tour of the Clinton, oh, there's in the back. I got a tour of the library today, and it was just amazing to me how many facts and details that he knew about the library. So I started trying to throw in questions that I was like, there's no way he has an answer to this. So I was like, okay, well, how many bricks are made up of the Clinton Library? And he's like, 5,400. I was like, you got to be kidding me. So I appreciate the tour and sincerely all the hard work. And I see a lot of great friends here in the audience today. Everyone knows her as Dr. West, Dr. Sharice West. I know her as Auntie Sharice. So it is good, very good seeing her, and thank you so much for being here and all your support. Regan Moffett, April Stewart, thank you so much. Dr. Williams, thank you, and also want to thank another person who means a lot to me, who was actually already introduced to you, and that's my mother, who came down from Baltimore to be here. So thank you so much. And not just thank you for coming here, but just thank you for everything. Especially, you've done a whole lot more than just come here tonight, so I appreciate it. Happy Mother's Day again, because you deserve it every other day, and also Happy Mother's Day to all the mothers. And thank you for everything that you do. And it's so great to see so many young people here, too, as well. This is fantastic. So many bright faces. I'm loving it. I'm loving it. And it's really inspiring to be in a place that actually takes public service so seriously. Because in many times in our society, you're surrounded and you're in so many places that it seems like they don't. So many times we find this idea of public service and people find it to be intimidating, and people find it to be, oh, it's just so difficult, and people think public service needs to be a 0 or 60 thing. It's either I'm doing nothing or I'm, shaving my head to go, live in another country. The beauty about this place and the beauty about the leadership is that it's showing that it's an obligation for all of us. It's showing that all of us, the work that we do every single day inside of your homes, inside of your communities, makes the difference. It can make the difference between what kind of communities that we live in, what type of families that we raise, or what type of societies that our kids are going to grow up in. You all understand that simple fact. And it's amazing being in a place and being surrounded by people who, when they talk about public service, they say it without a hint of cynicism. It's amazing being in a place that when you talk about public service, that they can talk about the virtues of public service without at all wondering what's in it for me. That you can talk about public service and talk about the commitment, the change that you're making in communities without then laughing about it later on. The work that's done here is invaluable. The work that you do inside of your communities is invaluable. Because sometimes it can seem like a completely uphill battle and completely daunting trying to make the change inside of communities. But the fact is, as long as we're all willing to work at it, and as long as we're all willing to make that commitment to do it, that the work can be done. I'll paraphrase Margaret Mead when she said that never underestimate the power of a small group of people in order to change the world, because in fact, it's the only thing that ever has. A small, committed group of people can change the world, as long as we're willing to fight through. And it's also pretty amazing just being here right now, because now that we've actually put out this book, and for some who've already taken a look at it, it was extraordinarily unlikely that I'd be the one up here at this microphone talking about these issues. For people that knew me back a long time ago, people like Auntie Sharice and people like my mom, the fact that I'm up here right now talking about these issues is probably a huge stretch for a lot of folks. But had it not been for people who took this idea and this concept of public service seriously, had it not been for people who saw a kid who they saw things in me that I didn't even see in myself yet. They saw a potential in me that I did not even know existed. And they took it seriously. And they said, we're going to help him get him across that finish line, kicking or screaming if need be. But we're going to get him across that finish line. Had it not been for that level of commitment, that level of sincerity, then this story would be extraordinarily unlikely. I was actually living down in Maryland. Well, our family was living down in Maryland. And when I was about 3.5 years old, my father passed away from something called acute epiglottitis. And basically, it's when you have an epiglottis every time we speak or every time we breathe, it lifts up and allows air into your windpipe. He essentially got a virus inside of his that caused a swelling of his epiglottis to the point that it eventually just sat on top of his windpipe, and fundamentally his body suffocated itself. And when I was 3.5 years old, I watched my father die in front of me. And after that happened, my family started having a lot of difficulties with that transition. Immediately, my mother, unsuspected, completely surprisingly, immediately became a widow with three children in her late 20s. And I then became a very confused young boy who was old enough to know that my father had gone somewhere, but not quite old enough to know where he went. So that hole, that void, I started then filling with a lot of things that I probably shouldn't have been filling it with. That level of confusion about this transition into manhood that I was going through. That lack of understanding about what my role now was inside of the family started to manifest itself. So a few years after that, my mother was having a lot of difficulties with that transition, and so she decided to move us up to the Bronx, up to New York to be with my grandparents, her parents. And my grandparents had immigrated to the United States about two and a half decades prior. My grandfather is actually is Jamaican. My grandmother was born in Cuba. They got married in Jamaica, and then my grandfather became a minister. And so he moved to the United States, finished his degree, and then moved into the Bronx. And in the small home in the Bronx is where my mother, myself, and my two sisters all moved up to live with our grandparents. And while it was extraordinarily helpful and supportive for my mother to be around her parents and to help, because my grandparents were extraordinarily instrumental in terms of helping to raise us, those same challenges that I was developing continued to manifest themselves. We moved up to the Bronx at a very transitional time in the Bronx history. When you think about the early and mid-1980s inside of New York City and inside of many communities in this country, the introduction of crack cocaine, the excessive levels of violence that started to manifest themselves inside of communities. And then here I was, this young child who was trying to make sense of it all. And so by the time I was already a preteen, I was already in academic and disciplinary probation with my school, already doing academic and disciplinary problems with my school. I started getting in trouble in my neighborhood. By the time I was 11 years old, I got picked up for something called tagging. And I don't know if anybody knows what tagging is, but essentially it's just spray painting your names. And my name, the name I gave myself, it wasn't like anyone gave it to me. The name I gave myself was Kid Cupid. So, and knowing my spelling abilities, it was 2 Ks. With 2 Ks next to each other with a circle around it. That was my tag. And so when I was 11 years old, my friends and I were out playing on the side of this building in the Bronx. And he comes out, he has his bag over his shoulder, and he's like, hey, you want to tag? And I'm like, okay, yeah, of course I want to tag. So we pull out the spray paint cans and we shake them just to make sure it comes out nice and clean and even. And then I start spray painting my 2 Ks next to each other in the circle. And as soon as I finish up that circle, a cop car turns around the corner, you hear that distinctive whoop, whoop, the sounds of cop sirens. So we then look at each other and we start bolting off in different directions. He decides to run in one direction. I run in the other direction. I run in the direction of the cops, showing how intelligent I was. And within about 3 steps, maybe, I'm grabbed by them. All probably 80 pounds of me is picked up, handcuffs are thrown at me, and I'm thrown in the back of this police car. My friend probably made it a little bit far. He made it halfway down the block before they actually grabbed him and threw him in the police car as well. At this point, I am terrified. I have no idea what's about to happen, but I know none of the options are good that I'm looking at. So I knew what will probably happen at this point is I'm going to get sent down to the station in what they call, what is known as baby booking, where they send the juveniles. And then the next thing you know is my mom would have to get a call. And I could not wait for the response from my mom, hearing that she needed to come down to baby booking to come get her son. So I'm freaking out in the back of this car. I'm trying to be as tough as I can, which wasn't very tough. And I'm pleading with the officer. My friend is pretty smug. He didn't seem to care that much, which was really bothering me. And then finally, the cops, they come back in the car, they start giving us a lecture. And they start asking us about why we're doing what we're doing and you know, how stupid it was. And I'm trying to say, I know it was, and I'm sorry. My friend is like, listen, do what you got to do. And I'm telling him to be quiet because I knew his fate was my shared fate at that point. And then finally, the cops come out of the car, and they open the back doors. And they pull us out, and they take the cuffs off. And they take his bag, and they say, the bag is ours, now get moving. And I knew I caught a break that day. I knew I caught a real break because that was the first time in my life that I knew that my destiny was no longer my own. And that's an incredibly paralyzing and humbling feeling. When you know that someone else controls everything about you. They control your future, they control your short-term future and your long-term future, because they could have handled that very differently, and they didn't. And I said to myself that day, I will never put myself in that situation again. And then a week later, I was tagging on another wall inside of the Bronx. It's kind of like, I compare it to, it's that feeling after and there are a lot of people in this audience, you know, cover your ears on this, but it's a feeling of like a hangover, right? Where you're feeling so terrible and you're like, you know, I'll never do this again. And then Friday comes again, and your friends are going out again. And that next week, I was back out there doing that same stuff, and my mother was becoming increasingly frustrated with me. Because academically things weren't working out, disciplinary things weren't working out, my neighborhood things weren't working out. So she said, you know what, I've got to make a real change. And so my mother had been threatening me with military school ever since I was 8 years old. 8 years old, she says, you know, I'm going to send you to military school. And I said, yeah, okay, all right. And then 9 years old comes and she says, no, I'm really going to send you to military school. I was like, no, really, yeah, send me to military school. 10 comes, 11 comes. Then she starts actually giving brochures of these military schools that actually like add some like tangible evidence to this threat. And I meet those threats with the same, you know, same level of indifference. And then one day she says, you know what? I've signed you up and you're going to military school. And again, I thought she was kidding, and she's like, no, really, next week you're heading off to military school. And so that next week, my bags are all packed, and I end up going to a place called Valley Forge Military Academy in Pennsylvania, a military school. And I remember that look I gave my mother as she was walking out of those gates. When she was like, goodbye, and I'm like, bye. Because I knew she was the reason for this pain that I was about to go through. And that first morning at military school, that first morning we went to bed the night before, and the next morning, you start hearing this heavy metal music. I don't know, any of y'all know Guns N' Roses? And you know that song, Welcome to the Jungle? You know how that all goes. These lights are flashing on and off inside the hallway. All these teenagers, these angry sounding teenagers are yelling and screaming at us to get out of our beds and get out of our racks, and I didn't even know what a rack was, but get out of your racks, get out of your racks. Get out in the corridor. What's a corridor? Get out in the corridors. And they're yelling and screaming at me. Well, not at me, but at everybody. It felt like they were screaming directly at me. They have trash cans, and they're smashing it with sticks, making noise. And I look over at the clock, and the clock says it's 5:30 in the morning. And so my roommate, we're in bunk beds. My roommate, I'm on the top bunk, he's on the bottom bunk. My roommate jumps out of bed, and his legs are shivering and quaking, and he looks up at me, and he's just like, come on, Moore. My last name. He's like, come on, Moore. We got to get up. We got to go in the hallway. And I look back at the clock, and I look at him. I said, man, it's 5:30 in the morning. I said, tell him to come get me right 8 o'clock. I should be ready to go right then. As if this was an option. And so he looks at me, and I don't know if he couldn't figure out whether I was really, really brave or really stupid. And he wasn't going to wait to figure out which one it was. So he then runs inside the hallway, and he runs outside the door, and he gets to the position of attention, which we learned the day before. And then I don't know why I hear my first sergeant, who was, this 18, 19-year-old senior, yell, "Why is there only one person outside this door?" And then kicks my door, slams it open. There's like, the blue paint on the door is like chipping off because he kicked the door so hard. He's yelling, he's screaming at me, and I have my back to him because I'm laying in the bed. And he's yelling and screaming. I can feel like spit hitting the back of my head. And I slowly start to turn around, and I roll over to him, and I look him in the face, and then he stops yelling because I think he thought his yelling was actually doing the trick. And I look at him and I say, "Man, if you don't get out of my room, I'm 12. He's 19. So he looks at me, and he gives this little smile, and he leaves my room. So the first thing I'm thinking is, this military school thing ain't bad. I think I can get used to this, actually. And then out of nowhere, probably about 10 seconds later, the door slams open again, and my entire chain of command walks in the room. And they pick my mattress up off of the mattress frame, and they turn it over as if I wasn't even still on the mattress. And they turn it over, and then I fall 5 feet to the ground and slam to the ground, and that was my first morning of military school. So you could tell that my mother was not my favorite person on my list at that point, because I was just so mad at being there, the fact that I had to be there. But my mother was teaching me something that day. And throughout my entire time there, and it's something that I began to learn. That my mother was showing me that her job was not to be my friend. Her job was to be my mother. Her job wasn't to be there and give me everything that I wanted, give me everything that I said that I had to have. Her job was to be there and to give me what I needed. And at the time, she knew what I needed was a chance to really grow up. I needed to understand this process that I was going through, and I needed to understand the larger point of who I was and why I was there. Now, things got bad after that. I mean, I ran away 5 times in the first 4 days from military school. I mean, I did not want to be there. I mean, really did not want to be there. And literally after the 5th time that I ran away, they caught me in the woods, running away. It was midnight. It's a long story. I talk about it in the book, but basically they drew me a map, and you had to get to the train station. The map was fake. It sent me to the middle of the woods. I'm crying. It was just a bad night all the way around. And I was in the middle of something called plebe system. And what plebe system was, it's your first 6 weeks at the school. And you were not allowed any outside communication. No phone calls, no radio, no television, nothing. It was a chance where they were going to break you down as individuals and build you up as a team. Because they helped me to understand that the only way I could survive is if my plebe brothers pushed me. And the only way my plebe brothers would survive is if I pushed them. It helped me to understand what you all fundamentally understand, and that's the larger interconnectedness of our entire society, is that if we have all hands on deck, and if we have everybody involved in this process called life, then we're going to be just fine. But what they said was, they were like, listen, if we don't give them some type of opportunity to do something different, we're going to lose them. So they said, you're allowed to make one phone call. Call who you want, but you're allowed one phone call, and you've got 5 minutes to do it. And I called the only number that I knew, Mom. So my mom gets a call. She wasn't expecting to hear from me for 6 weeks, and now here it is in the first 4 days there, she gets a call at 1 o'clock in the morning. So I can imagine her wake-up call. So she calls, she's like, is everything all right? And I'm like, everything's fine. Everything's great. I just want to come home. And I told her, I'll do better. I'll clean my room. I'll clean your room. I'll do whatever you want me to do. Just let me come home. And that's when she stopped me. And she said, too many people have sacrificed in order for you to be here. Too many people have worked too hard in order for you to have this opportunity. And she said, and your father's looking down on you, and he's proud of you. He just wants you to give it a shot. And even though, again, it didn't happen overnight, I started to give it a shot. And I started to understand the larger point. I started to understand the idea that leadership matters. accountability matters, responsibility matters, honor matters. All the basic tenets that they were trying to teach us at this school, I actually began to internalize. And then by the end of that mandatory year, when I had the chance to go back to school, when I had the chance to go back to my old school, my mother said, listen, you've done well academically, you've made honor roll, you're actually allowed to play sports, because before I could play sports, I was just always on probation, so they wouldn't let me. And I did well athletically. And she said, you have a chance to go back now, and I said, I'd actually rather stay, if it's okay. Because I realized that what happened wasn't that I was picked out of one community and put into another community. This wasn't about transporting me physically, per se. This was about a psychological transformation that was happening. This was about the fact that I began to understand what manhood actually was and what was expected of me. What my role was in a larger, not just in my family as a larger family, but in terms of as a larger society. And so after I ended up finishing up school there, ended up joining the Army and becoming an Army officer, I went off to Johns Hopkins. And this is where the story of the book begins. Because while I was a senior, while I was actually a junior at that point at Johns Hopkins University, I had a chance to study abroad in South Africa. And I know I've had a chance to talk to a lot of students about some of the overseas work that you all are either about to do or completed in your summer before. And I had a chance to go to South Africa, and what I was studying there was actually music, and music's effects on social change, and how musicians, even more so than policymakers in many countries and in many cultures, even with our own country, have been able to move masses in many ways and actually educate people and talk to people about what was going on, much more than many others, even policymakers and politicians and academics could, by simply using their craft and using their music and using their skills. And South Africa was one of the countries that I had the pleasure of visiting to look at how the music of the apartheid era really helped to educate the world about what was happening. And then my mother and I were talking on the phone. And she said, I've got something crazy to tell you. I said, what's going on? And she said, there are wanted posters all over your neighborhood. There are wanted posters all over your neighborhood for someone wanted for the murder of a police officer. And his name is Wes Moore. And I said, what? And she was like, the posters there say, if you see Wes Moore, do not approach because he's assumed to be armed and very dangerous. And that was how I first learned about the other Wes Moore. And later on, as I came back home, I got more details about the crime and I got more details about the story. What happened was 4 guys walked into a jewelry store. 2 guys had guns, 2 guys had mallets. The 2 guys with the guns got everybody on the ground, and the 2 guys with mallets then proceeded to go around the jewelry store, smashing jewelry cases and grabbing watches and rings and necklaces as they went through. With all that chaos going on, everyone who was inside the store kept their heads down, scared to move. Once they got around and finished clearing out the jewelry cases, one of the guys yelled, let's go, and then 4 guys ran outside of the jewelry store. And all 4 ran out with about a little over $400,000 worth of jewelry. One of the people who were inside the jewelry store at that time was an off-duty police sergeant who was moonlighting as a security guard. This gentleman was a 13-year veteran of the police force. He had 5 children. He just had triplets. And that's why he was working that second job. He wasn't even supposed to be there that day. Someone else was on duty that day, but then had to take off. So this police sergeant said he'd cover for him, and he went into work. The 4 guys ran out of the jewelry store. He went out and ran after them. And he was hiding next to vehicles to try to figure out where they were to see if he can stop them before they actually got away. And he didn't realize that one of the vehicles that he was kneeling next to was one of the vehicles that they were in. And then a window rolled down. And a hand reached out and took 3 shots at point-blank range, and 2 hit the police officer in his chest, and 1 hit him in the head and killed him instantly. And there was a 12-day national manhunt for these 4 guys for the tragic and unnecessary murder of this police sergeant. And finally, they caught all 4 of them. And one of the guys that they caught, as I learned out, as I later learned, was living in the same neighborhood that I was in, living in the same area. He was around the same age as I was. He also came up in a single-parent household. He also had trouble academically and disciplinary, as he was growing up, and he was also named Wes Moore. And this is where, as I first learned more about him, this story haunted me. Because as I was heading off to England on this scholarship, the other Wes Moore ended up getting life in prison without the possibility of parole. Him, his older brother, and 2 other guys all got life without parole for the death of Sergeant Prothero, the police sergeant. And so the story haunted me to the point that even years after I first learned about him, I couldn't shake it. I wanted to know more. I had questions that I wanted to have answers to. My basic curiosity. How did this happen? Do you see your brother in prison? How do you feel about your brother? I knew Wes had kids. I knew he had 4 kids from the articles I read. Do you ever get a chance to see your kids? How do you feel about this incident? Are you remorseful? Are you sorry? And so one day, I decided to write him. I called the prison and I said, how do I get in contact with a person who you have inside the prison? I got the information and I wrote him a note. Here's how I heard about you. And I asked him these series of questions. And I wasn't sure if I'd hear back from him, and quite honestly, it didn't matter to me. I just knew I had questions that I wanted to get off my chest, and I knew that's what I could control. And I did. And then a month later, I get an envelope from Jessup Correctional Institution from Wes Moore. And the first thing that he writes in the letter, he says, first he thanked me for writing because he said, when you're in prison, you think that the whole world doesn't know you exist anymore. And then he proceeded to answer all the questions that I'd listed out. That one letter turned into dozens of letters. Those dozens of letters eventually turned into dozens of visits. And that became the baseline and the premise of the book that I produced today. Now, I say that and I share that in no way to glorify Wes or to make people sympathetic with him. Never can we ever forget the crime and what happened and the pain that happened to that police sergeant's family. But what I realized as I was talking to him, that there were bigger truths to be understood. There were larger messages to be understood. And the idea that fundamentally what we had were 2 kids who at similar times in their life were both searching for help. 2 kids who at similar times in their life were both searching for more. And one kid got it, and the other kid didn't. And now the world can bear witness to either our attention or our apathy, and what the ramifications of all of our decisions are. Because the fact remains is that this story is about much more than just 2 boys. This story is about much more than Baltimore. It's about much more than one socioeconomic group. It's about much more than just one race. It's about much more than just one era. This story is about all of us. This story is about all the decisions that we make every day and how little that blurs the line in between our life and another life altogether. About had it not been for proper intervention, had it not been for some pretty aggressive and pretty creative intervention on a lot of people who were inside of my life, had it not been for some tentative steps in the right direction. As I say in the cover of the book, the chilling truth is that his story could have been mine. And the tragedy is that my story could have been his. Because had those interventions, had those levels of concern and support been there in his life, his mother was the first in her family to go to college. She was at Johns Hopkins University, and then eventually lost the grants that would have allowed her to finish. Had small decisions, had small factors been there that ended up making a big difference in the lives of her and her kids and the family that she raised, had those things been in place, the tragedy is that my story could have been his. And so really what I want this book to be, and what I want this entire process to be, it's not about 2 kids. It's a larger call to action. It's a larger call to action for our entire society about what type of society are we trying to foster. What type of society were you trying to raise? The type of community service that you all don't just talk about here, but that you enforce and that you preach and that you mandate and that you reinforce is what our nation needs. The fact that we have people who are willing to say, I'm willing to give a little bit of myself if it means giving a lot to society. I'm willing to give a little bit of my time if it's going to make a big difference to someone who needs it. What happened that day on February 7th, 2000 was an absolute and utter tragedy. And the thing that, and I say that, and one thing I say with the book is I didn't write the book to challenge or to retry what happened that day or retry Wes's case. What I wanted to examine was why his fate was sealed long before February 7, 2000. What happened in the lead up? What happened when he was 11 and 12 and 13 when intervention could have worked? And it wasn't there. There's a larger point, there's a larger idea to all of us. There's a larger interconnectedness to all of us. And that's the fundamental point. Our names helped us to understand each other, helped us to connect. But there were larger truths to be understood. And that was the process that we went through. And one of the things I'm so excited about this is that you get a chance to talk to people around the country about this book and who've got a chance to read the book and understand its mission, is you see just how similar so many lives are. And people tell me about the Wes Moores in their own life, or how just 5 years ago they were something else, or had this person not intervened, or that person not intervened, that their life would be completely different. We are all on this journey, we're all on this path together. And the more people we can help to understand that, the more people we can bring along and we can enlist to become part of this army and part of this movement, the easier and more beautiful the destinies will be for so many people who are existing around now. That's our obligation. That's our vow. And as long as we're willing to do that, as long as what you're teaching here is willing to be reinforced and pushed, then there's no doubt in my mind that the society that we're living in can continue to become a better one, as long as we're willing to take that to heart. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you for your time. Bless you. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to say, I think I went a little over a lot
You're
of time.
fine.
Okay, but because I did want to leave time for questions. And again, whatever questions you have about the book process, about Afghanistan, finance, the Baltimore Ravens, whatever you guys want to ask, I'm more than willing to. But it's an absolute honor to be here, and I would love to have a conversation.
All right, let's, if you raise your hands, please wait for the microphone to get to you for the questions. So we have questions. We'll start right here. Let me get you this mic.
I appreciate you coming.
Thank you, sir.
Tell me, how vital is it for mentoring organizations as well as the whole community really get involved in preventing what happened to West by creating more rites of passage programs?
Sure. I can grab that. Thank you so much. Is it okay? Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. And what was your name, sir?
Renaldo Williams, Empowerment Initiative online newsletter.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Mr. Williams. Thank you. The questions about rites of passage programs. There's actually a scene in the book where I talk about my time in South Africa. And one of the things that I got to experience in South Africa, because my Buti, my brother, when I was in South Africa, was about to go through his own rites of passage program. And one of the tribes inside of South Africa is a Xhosa tribe. And that was a tribe of Nelson Mandela and Govan Mbeki. And when their young boys are going through this manhood process, they take them all into the bush, and the first thing they do is they circumcise them, and then they spend a month inside of the bush as the boys are healing. They're then teaching them about what it means to be a Xhosa man. about the tribes, about the wars they fought, about the histories, about the men that they have inside of their history. And then when they come back into society, they wear all white, and they wear a white brimmed hat, and they're welcome to a huge feast that the whole community puts on. And then they wear white it varies, but they wear white for about a month after they come back from the bush. And it was amazing to me to see how that process actually worked, because it was the first time I'd seen something like that. I'd seen a process where that transformation from boyhood into manhood was actually welcomed with a ceremony, where that process wasn't something that we almost just fell into, but something that there was an actual official process in when that manhood journey began. And it was something that I had a lot of conversations with Wes about, where we talked about, when did you think that manhood actually began for him? Or when did manhood begin for me? And we kind of said, well, it was kind of something where we felt we had more responsibility for something other than ourselves, where we felt like people were relying on us, so on and so forth. But both of the answers that I think we gave each other I think it still seemed relatively enigmatic, where we weren't quite sure what we were grasping at and weren't quite sure what we were looking for. So I think the process and the importance of helping boys to understand what manhood means, helping women understand young girls to understand what womanhood means, is an extraordinarily important one, because it's an extraordinarily important role. And it's difficult to think of any type of role that's important in our society that there's no training for, right? I mean, I couldn't take over a platoon without any training. I need training before I can take over my platoon. I couldn't walk into my role in business and say, hey, now you got a business. And I'm like, but I don't understand what an asset or liability is. It's okay, it's your business. You need training. And that's why I think it's important that we actually have a training process and helping kids understand, what does adulthood really mean? What does that responsibility mean? What does it mean to have a family? You know, and that's part of the larger challenge, and I'll wrap it up, but I think it's one of the large challenges you have, what happened with Wes. Wes also had his first child when he was 16, had his second child when he was 17, had another child when he was 19, had another child when he was 20. His mother had her first, Wes became a grandfather at 33 years old. So, when you become a parent, it's jarring at any age, right? I look at a lot of parents, I see a lot of heads nod. It's jarring when you become a parent in your 20s and 30s and 40s. Imagine becoming a parent before you're even an adult yourself. And so these things have to be understood by kids as they're going through this process. And one of the things I'm most proud of inside of the book, you'll see, is at the end of the book, there's a resource guide where we list over 200 organizations that are on the ground doing the work. One of the things that was really frustrating to me was you talk to people and say, no one's doing it. No one's doing the work. No one cares. That's fundamentally not true. It's fundamentally not true. There are people who are doing the work. The question is, how are we providing them the shine and the resources and the scalability in order to really help bring their work to a larger audience? And that's one of the things that we try to do, that I try to do with this book. But thank you very much. Thank you.
Hi, Wes. I'm Georgia Miarton, and I run a program for homeless children here in Little Rock. Thank you for coming to our community. I just wanted to ask you talked a lot about your mom and the role that your mother played in connecting you with great organizations and great opportunities. So my question is, what do you think we can do when the parents are not bought in, when the parents are not there and the mothers are not like your mom? How much of a role can we have?
Very, very good question, Georgia, and thank you. And thank you for the work that you do as well. Both of you, thank you for the work that you do. It is one of the real fundamental challenges that we've got in our society, because a lot of times you have parents who are inside of communities, and as great as the parents are, if you're inside a community where you feel like the community is almost actively working against you, it becomes very difficult. Or also if you're in an environment or your child is in a school where you have high expectations but you have a parent who you feel like is actively working against you, it becomes very difficult. Obviously the best case scenario is obviously when you hit that perfect marriage. But one thing that my mother always says, and I firmly believe this to be the truth, is kids need to think that you care before they care what you think. Kids need to think that you care before they care what you think. And a lot of times, if it's not going to be, in the unfortunate situation where you have one or both parents that are in the latter case scenario that I talked about before, where they are almost part of the problem in a child's life, if the child feels that there are other people who are there to support, if that child feels that there are other people who are there to give the guidance, and that child feels that there are other people around them who are willing to provide that kind of leverage that they need, it's amazing how you'll see them perform. You know, one thing I firmly believe is that the burden of adulthood is so heavy. And it's in many cases too heavy when you're talking to a 12 or 13 or 14-year-old. Our job as society, our job as adults, is basically just to help give them a little lift, just until their shoulders become broad enough that they can carry the load by themselves. And if you have a situation, again, the unfortunate situation, where you have both parents and it seems like that's actively not working, there still are ways that you can target into a child, as long as you're willing to show them that I'm willing to meet you halfway. I'm willing to provide you that support. I'm willing to provide you that leverage. And we see it. You know, we see situations. We see scenarios. I had a mention program in Baltimore. We work with kids involved in the juvenile justice system. And we had 2 boys in particular in our very first class that was their situation. It was like, trying to pull teeth to get them. And in fact, there really wasn't even their mother. It was really more their grandmother who was raising them, which is another unfortunate situation we see in a lot of communities. But as long as you're willing to show them that we're willing to help provide that support that you might not be getting from elsewhere, it's amazing how they will perform. And it's amazing the type of difference that you'll make. But as long as they genuinely feel that their vested interest is your vested interest, if they feel that, you'll actually be able to make some progress. Thank you.
Young man right here. Wait, look, give you the mic.
My name is Tony Humphrey, and I attend Cloverdale Middle.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you for being here, Tony.
Thank you. I have 2 questions.
Bring them on.
My-
Bring them on.
My first question is, what college did you attend?
First question, I attended 2 colleges. The first college I attended was Valley Forge Military College, which is actually a junior college. And I'm a very proud community college graduate. And also, that's also the school where I received my not just my associate's degree, but also a commission in the United States Army. And then I also finished up at Johns Hopkins University.
Yes.
It's a good school, you should consider it.
And my second question is, if you would get a chance to come speak to my school, because
I like you, Tony. I like you. I like you. Tony, what year are you going into? What year are you going into next year? You're going into 8th grade? Oh, that's a good year, man. 8th grade, that's when I was 12. I tell you what, come see me after this. We'll make it happen, okay? We'll make it happen. All right.
How are you, Mr. Moore? Thank you for coming. It was a pleasure meeting you earlier.
Pleasure to meet you. Good seeing you again.
My name is Demas Espinola. I'm now a graduate of the Clinton School, so thank you. Life is no doubt a two-way street, and so I know that there are always a lot of individuals who can provide a lot of support, but what about yourself as an individual do you feel made you receptive as a 12-year-old, where you didn't turn the other way when your mother sent you to a military school? And in terms of the other Westmore, did you see any differences between you two in terms of how you receive all this support from different individuals?
It's a very good point. Wes has had a chance to read the book, and there was really 2 things that really pushed me in order to write the book in the first place. Because when I was first approached about this idea that this could be something larger, my first initial answer was no. I didn't want to do it. I felt like I didn't have time. I felt like I didn't want to explore his life that deeply, and I really didn't want to explore my own life that deeply, quite honestly. And there were 2 things that really pushed me in order to do it. And let's come back to your question. The first thing was I thought about the officer's family. And I thought about if there was a way that we could create a type of understanding so these tragedies don't have to happen anymore, then I think this was a process that was worth doing. And I thought about something that Edmund Burke said when he said, all it takes for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. And then I thought about something that Wes told me, because I remember I went to go see Wes about it, and I told him, what had happened, and he said, you know what? He said, I've wasted every opportunity I've ever had in life, and I'm going to die in here. So if you can do something that can help people better understand the ramifications for their decisions and better understand the neighborhoods in which these decisions are being made, then I think you should do it. I think that one of the reasons that I became pretty receptive was I started to understand not just the level of sacrifice that was taking place in my own life, but I started to understand that my second chances were running out. And there's a part in the book where we were talking about second chances. Wes and I are talking about second chances and how when you're young, you believe that second chances just kind of automatically come. That you do bad things and people forgive you and you move on, and you do more bad things, even if it's the same thing, and people forgive you and you move on. But that line between second chances and last chances can be very thin and very unforgiving. And that's why also the decisions that we make when we're younger have such long-term ramifications if they're not the right ones, or have long-term ramifications if they are the right ones. So I think I started to appreciate and understand, I think kind of being in a relatively isolated environment of the military school helped really to make that pretty profound on my life pretty early, was the importance of understanding that second chances are pretty fleeting, and that if you didn't grow up, and if you didn't understand that those second chances were going to come to an end at some point, that those second chances coming ends will be forced on you. And it would be very difficult for you to walk back from that. And that was in me also kind of that larger importance of education. That education for me wasn't simply about the importance of reading, writing, and arithmetic, even though that's all incredibly important, but also the fact that education taught me things like critical thinking. And education taught me things like process analysis, and what it actually meant to make decisions that not only made sense short-term, but also make sense long-term. And I think those are a lot of conversations that Wes and I have as well, where he's just like, those lessons those basic lessons like that are ones that he just learned way too late.
Hi, my name is Emily Fisher. I'm also a recent graduate.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I have a question not related to the book. Earlier you spoke of your time as a White House fellow and working for the State Department, and you spoke about sort of analyzing international development aid and its impact. And I was wondering what takeaways from that experience, specifically with international aid, that you had.
I had a chance to have a lunch with a group of students, and I'm really, really thankful for that opportunity, and thank you also for that question. When I was a White House fellow, I had the honor of serving with the 82nd Airborne Division in Afghanistan. We were on the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan, and basically for 2005 and 2006. And you got a chance to see how policy was processed and administered as a paratrooper, as a foot soldier inside this area. Then the year after, I got a chance to come back as a White House fellow and then work at the State Department as a special assistant to the Secretary of State. And then you got a chance to see how those policies are created. And so when you spend a year seeing how policies are administered, and then you spend a year seeing how policies are created, you see there's a disconnect at times. And there's a disconnect, and again, it's no one's fault. It's just the idea that there's a space sometimes in between, and it's important that the policymakers understand that space, and how at times that the policies that you're making, how they are going to correlate and actually translate once they actually work their way all the way down to the people on the ground that you're hoping to affect. One of my areas that I focused on was actually foreign aid and foreign assistance, and basically where the United States, gives out, again, we're talking less than 1%. Less than 0.5% of the federal budget goes towards foreign aid. So I know a lot of people think, how much do we give foreign aid? 10% of our budget. I mean, it's less than 0.5% of our budget goes towards other countries. But it's a large sum of money. And you think about the good that that money can do if it's just used and allocated correctly and wisely, and if we have some form of accountability in terms of what we're looking for. One thing that didn't happen, and it actually started the process during the latter years of the Bush administration, was they actually wanted to have quantifiable effects as to how foreign aid is being administered, how foreign aid is being used, and the fact that I had background in business and also background in the military, they thought this would be a good use of time and energy for my process. One thing that I saw throughout that, and again, just in all transparency, is how difficult it is to really make sure that, first of all, just to have first that clear understanding of what is the point of foreign aid, because I think there's two very different camps on how foreign aid should be used and what is the point of foreign aid in the first place. And then the second thing is, how exactly do you come up with clear analysis? How exactly do you come up with those clear pillars of what does progress look like and what does progress mean? However, it is one of the most important things that we can do as a government, and one of the most important things that we can do as a foreign service, as a State Department, as USAID, because in many cases, even more so than military might, what we do in terms of reconstruction, what we do in terms of development, what we do in terms of building roads and wells and clean water access and that kind of thing, that is going to mean so much more in terms of our long-term stability and long-term progress as not just a nation but as a world in terms of our foreign policy than how many troops we can put on the ground. I mean, one thing I've always believed and said about Afghanistan as a perfect example, there is no winnable military solution for Afghanistan. Now, there's a space that the military can help create, a space where you can actually have some type of conversation about reconstruction development that only the military can help create that space. But the real progress has to take place with making sure that we get foreign aid and foreign assistance right. Making sure that we get reconstruction and development right. Because that's the only way we're going to come up with long-term solutions to some of our most pressing challenges and pressing problems that we've got right now. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Mallory Martin.
Valerie?
Mallory
Oh,
Martin.
Nice to meet you.
I'm a student at Central High School here in Little Rock, and my principal is just actually right up there.
Thank you. Thank you.
I was, well, you said you sent lots of letters to the other Westmore, and I was wondering if it was more of like an acquaintance or if it was just getting information for your book. Did you form a
question.
bond with him, and are you still in contact with him?
Very, very good questions. I had known Wes while before I decided to turn this into a book, and the question is asked now, and I just being completely honest, you're like, will you stay in touch with him after? My honest answer is this: is that I didn't get in touch with Wes to write a book, so I don't plan on necessarily not being in touch with him now that the book is done. I think I've grown as a person by getting to know Wes because I better understand my own life now. I understand my own process now. I better appreciate my life now, and I think Wes says the same thing about him now, about this process for himself. I can never forget why he's there, and I want to be very clear on that. I can never forget about the crime. I can never forget about the pain to that police sergeant's family, and it's something that sits with me every day, and I wake up with it every morning, and I go to bed with it every night. But I also know that it is also my firm belief that even our worst actions don't separate us from the circle of humanity. And that by understanding Wes, there were and still are greater truths to be understood. And that's why I got in contact with him. And that's quite honestly why I plan on staying in contact with him. It's not because I feel bad for him. It's not because I'm sympathetic towards him. But I do believe that there is a larger circle, there's a larger truth to be understood, and I know again that I've grown as a person throughout this entire process. It's a good question.
One more question. Oh, right. Well, let's see, we got two.
I'll keep my answer short. I'm sorry.
This guy right here, he's had his hand up a long time.
My name is Cameron Cook from Cloverdale Magnet Middle School also.
Hey, Cameron.
My question is, what would you do if you could meet your father one more time?
What would you do if you could see your father one more time? See, why in the world do we have to give him the microphone? Great question. It's interesting. I said I'm gonna keep this answer short. I actually asked Wes to do something throughout this process, then I did it myself. I asked him to write a letter to his father. Wes has seen his father 3 times in his life. The last time Wes saw his father, Wes was 14 years old. And when I asked him to do it because we talked about it, when we were talking about our fathers not being there, and Wes said, your father wasn't there because he couldn't be, and my father wasn't there because he chose not to be, and therefore we're going to mourn their absence in different ways. So I put that to the test, and I said, well, Wes, do me a favor, write a letter to your father. And if you can get a chance to see your father again, what would you say? And again, Wes saw his father for the last time when he was 14 years old. Wes walked into his father's mother's house, his paternal grandmother. and which is interesting because he's a very close relationship with her, but just doesn't have a relationship with her son, who's his father. And he saw him sleeping on the couch. And he was sleeping there, and the game was on in the background. Wes tapped him on the shoulder and woke him up. And then his father looked up at Wes and he said, "Who are you?" And Wes talked about how much that broke his heart for the fact that his father didn't even recognize him. So Wes wrote this letter to his father, and in that letter, it's the most fascinating collection of anger and hurt and pain and love and sympathy. So it's obvious that he hadn't fully come to grips with what this meant. And so I only did the fair thing, and I did it myself too. And I wrote a letter to my father, if I ever had the chance to see him again. And I realized that in many cases I haven't fully come to grips with it either. Because I think part of my challenges was there was a lot of anger, and there was a lot of hurt as to why he had to leave. I heard so many amazing stories about who he was as a person, and what he meant to so many people. And the fact that I only had 2 memories of him. One was when my mother got mad at me for hitting my sister. And he came up to my room and he helped to explain to me why she was so upset. And the only other memory I have of him was when I watched him die. So I realized that there was still a lot that I haven't fully dealt with and come to grips. I think if I ever got a chance to see him again, I would just hope that he's proud of me. I would just hope that he's proud of me.
This is our final question, because we got a lot of books to sign.
My name is Wilson Borkowski.
Hey, Wilson.
And how did the other Westmore react when he read the book?
My goodness. It's interesting. I remember a quote. I will come back to your question. I remember a quote that I heard Malcolm X say once about when he was speaking to college students, and how he said he was having a debate amongst college presidents, and he said, I'll talk to college presidents anytime. He said, the people I'm most afraid to speak to are actually college students. And I realized I'm taking it down to the next level. It's not even college students. Wes had 2 main reactions when he read the book. One, he was fascinated about the research that went into it. I did over 200 hours of interviews with him, his family and friends, and my family and friends. And with every interview, you may have to make sure that you were corroborating, that you were, verifying all the facts that you heard, because if it was going to be in there, you had to make sure that it was checked and double-checked. So one, he was amazed at how much research went into it and how I was able to get the facts right on all the stories. And the second thing that he said to me, which was really actually pretty heartbreaking, was he said after reading about his life in a book, it amazed him at how little that he's done with his life. And those are really his two main reactions after he got a chance to read it.